Welcome back to Catholic Reboot. This is the second part of the episode titled Can Popes Go to Hell? I know that's a little drastic of a title, but it's actually the way it started. Was through a question as to whether it was possible that a pope go to hell. All right, so there's quite a lot to be discussed, and so that's why I want to be very careful on how we go through this, right? So where we had left off was pretty much talking about the difference between a pope committing a sin as a human being versus a pope committing heresy as the vicar of Christ here on earth. We also went through quite a bit on what the difference between those two were, right? Just as a quick recap before we get into the second part, what we constantly come up against is the heresy or the active heresy against the church, and in so doing, when you do have a pope committing heresy, then it actually breaks what we understand to be papal infallibility. So, and this may be going down too deep of a rabbit hole, but there is a difference between what is perceived heresy and material heresy. What I'll try to do is at the very end put something that actually defines that for you. All right. Now, the other reason I did the first episode instead of jumping into this part was I thought it'd be too confusing. It almost be like jumping into a cold pool, right? So I wanted to kind of give you that lukewarm pool before getting into it. And then you'd also know what I'm talking about, right? So it may seem that previous popes may have broken the infallible doctrine, but they really didn't, right? And I started to explain that in the previous episode. And this is why we would say, since it's Christ's church, the Holy Ghost is required to oversee the vicars throughout history. And once again, this is not to protect a man-made church, like is in the case of Martin Luther, but Christ's church. So we have to make that distinction and understand that Christ never said that he didn't mean man to sin, that we're in the church. What he meant that was men would not destroy it, okay? So this is why it was so important for church councils and encyclicals and papal bulls, because it is the official act of the Vicar of Christ, right? That's why we have quite a bit of a problem with Pope Francis, who loves to have these one-off interviews or informal comments, because quite honestly, they're meaningless to us. If they don't add to the doctrine of the faith, or if they don't become part of our dogmas, we just ignore them. And it's sad to say that you would ignore a pope when he speaks, but we're almost required to, because it's too confusing. So let me be even much more specific at how the church magisterium is in place to make sure the church does not go off the rails, right? So believe it or not, there are tools in place, right? In 2016, several cardinals cited certain conflicting interpretations of Pope Francis in what they called an apostolic exhortation on love in the family. The four prominent cardinals wrote a letter. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. It was kind of a well-kept secret within the church groups. But they sent him a letter on September of 2016 requesting that he resolve the uncertainties and bring some sort of clarity, right? Now, why is that important? Because if these novelties start to come out, what the Pope has to understand is the faithful can get confused very easily. And so that he has to be very clear in what he is saying. And this is what these cardinals were attempting to have done when they sent the letter. So, if you want a full text of this, I can send it to you. I'll have my email address there, but I'm going to read it to you. They said, we the undersigned, but also many bishops and priests, have received numerous requests from the faithful of various social strata on the correct interpretation to give to chapter 8 of the exhortation. Now, the cardinals wrote in their September 19th letter to the Pope with this opening. The signatories were Cardinal Walter Brandmuller, who is the President Emeritus of the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences. And again, if you get to know your federal government titles and levels, it's even more important that you get to know these cardinals and look it up so you know not only what their position is, what their background is, right? The second was Cardinal Raymond Burke. He's a heavy in the church, by the way, and I think I spoke about him in the past. He was actually what would be almost like the Supreme Court Justice of canon law for the church in Rome. Raymond Burke is the patron of the Order of Malta and the Prefect Emeritus of the Apostolic Signature. Now, little backstory on Raymond Burke. Once Pope Francis started to realize what kind of a problem Cardinal Burke was, he basically demoted him and gave him this title of over the Order of Malta, which is a significant departure from his previous position. I think the way Cardinal Burke looked at it is fine. It just gives me more time to do those things that are necessary to save the church, right? It's also Carlo Caffarra, who's the Archbishop Emeritus of Bologna, and Joachim Meisner, the Archbishop Emeritus of Cologne. Okay. Now, they noted the fact that theologians and scholars have proposed interpretations, right, of the Amoris Laetitia, especially its 8th chapter on accompanying, discerning, and integrating weakness, which are not only divergent positions, but also conflicting positions. So the cardinals also noted that the media have emphasized this dispute, which provokes uncertainty and confusion and even disorientation among many of the faithful. And so, in other words, this goes back to what I was saying before. When the Pope comes out and does these informal press conferences, he's causing damage to the church by feeding into a very liberal media who just love when he opens up his mouth so that they can assist in kind of tearing the church apart, right? Surely the media does not have a love for the Catholic Church. So they wrote, compelled in conscience by our pastoral responsibility and desiring to preach evermore to which your holiness urges us, we with profound respect ask you, Holy Father, as supreme teacher of the faith, called by the risen one to confirm his brothers in the faith, to resolve the uncertainties and bring clarity, benevolently giving a response to the dubia that we attach to the present letter they wrote. Okay? Now, I hope I can give you a proper explanation of what a dubia is. Again, I will have this in a placard card at the end. In short, what a dubia does is when you have the higher cardinals and bishops in the magisterium requesting that a pope explain himself, the dubia is just that. They are showing respect to the Pope as the Vicar of Christ in the seat of Peter, and they're saying, we know that you are the head of our church. So they're not questioning his authority. What they're questioning is either his conduct or his comments. In short, they have the right to send him this letter, this dubia, and they also have the right for it to be answered. Just to jettison forward, he has yet to answer it, which is very concerning. And in essence, he's basically saying, I refuse to answer your questions. That should raise a lot of concern, right? So anyway, the cardinals submitted 5 dubia or doubts about the interpretation of Amoris Laetitia to be clarified by its author, the Pope. Also drawing the dubia to the attention of Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, right? And by the way, just a slight note, prior to Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, he held that position. Now, a forward of the text of the letter notes that it arose from deep pastoral concern, following disorientation and great confusion of many faithful, and contrasting interpretations of apostolic exhortation, even within the Episcopal College. Now, what's really telling about this, for many of you Catholics that kind of rode the train of post-Vatican II, and you started seeing the significant number of errors being perpetrated by priests, bishops, and cardinals, you'll find this somewhat refreshing, that these group of cardinals are basically saying enough is enough. The faithful are looking at all these novelties as not only being a disorientation, they just don't know what to follow anymore. Church should never confuse the faithful. Why? Because there's only one master of confusion, and that's Satan. Christ was always very clear and direct on his teachings, right? Now, they wrote, the great tradition of the church teaches us that the way out of situations like this is recourse to the Holy Father, asking the Apostolic See to resolve those doubts which are the cause of disorientation and confusion, right? So far, good. They're showing him the respect that comes with his position as the Pope. And they're basically pleading with him, explain yourself. Why? Because they have their own responsibilities in their areas of authority, right? So cardinals and bishops have to govern a certain territory, and if the main man is speaking in a fashion that confuses their faithful, they have a responsibility because they will be judged for not standing up and doing something about it. They can't just stick their head in the sand, right? So on this basis, the 4 cardinals wrote that their submission of dubia is an act of justice because, and they said, in quotes, we profess that the Petrine ministry is the ministry of unity. Now, when they say Petrine or Petrine ministry, they're talking about the Pope. So if I had to translate, they'd say, we profess that the Pope is the minister of unity and of charity because we want to help the Pope to prevent divisions and conflicts in the church, asking him to dispel all ambiguity. Now, isn't that a novel concept? Okay, so the foreword noted that Pope Francis decided not to respond to their dubia. Now, and I don't want to stir things up, but what does this remind you of? When you see the significant liberal movements going on in our country, whenever the logical or obvious question is asked of the politicians, what do? They just don't respond, right? Great liberal tactic, right? They further went on to say, and I quote, we have interpreted his sovereign decision as an invitation to continue the reflection and the discussion calmly and with respect. And so we are informing the entire people of God about our initiative, offering all of the documentation. They expressed hope that their act would not only be interpreted according to the progressive conservative paradigm, that would be completely off the mark. They were deeply concerned about the true good of souls. It's the whole reason they wrote the Dubias. They were also concerned about the supreme law of the church and not about promoting any form of politics in the church, because that's what the liberal media and even some of the Pope's closest advisors were trying to say they were doing. They also stated, "We hope that no one will judge us unjustly as adversaries of the Holy Father and people devoid of mercy. What we have done and are doing has in its origin in the deep collegial affection that unites us to the Pope and from an impassioned concern for the good of the faithful." Right? All right. So what they're speaking about is the document the Pope had issued called Amoris Laetitia, right? And maybe if you do not want to go out and actually read it yourself, which you should as practicing Catholics, I will try to have another episode just on this, right? So the 5 dubia, or the 5 questions, were around this, and its relation to the teaching of the existing magisterium, especially that of St. John Paul II, or what I'd like to refer to as Pope Paul II. I'm not so sure I'm really understood that sainthood, but that's how they wrote it. I hope that doesn't make me a radical. All right, so in an appended note, they also went on further to explain, or the cardinals wrote that the dubia is, and according to their words, are worded in a way that requires a yes or no answer without theological argumentation. Okay? This way of addressing the Apostolic See is not an invention of their own, though. It's an age-old practice. They were actually seeking answers to the dubia, noting that, quote again, "Doubt and uncertainty are always highly detrimental to the pastoral care," right? Now, the yes and no requirement is also to show great respect for the Holy Father, because they're basically, if you opened up that door that these cardinals could always come together and bury him in deep theological or magisterial questions, he wouldn't be able to do his job as a pope. He'd be too busy writing all these responses. So they're very cognizant of this, and they wanted to make it easy as possible. So we will go through this. I don't think it's much to ask a pope. Do you still agree the church's position on homosexuality is it's not acceptable? Yes or no? That you can't answer that any other way. If he said no, he does not, then he's got a problem, because in essence he would have to call a council to explain it. And Pope Francis has been very good at avoiding anything that would require him to basically trip the wire of material heresy. Okay. All right. So they also emphasize that the differing interpretations of Amoris Laetitia, I'm going to call it AL, are, in quote, due to divergent ways of understanding the Christian moral life, and that more than merely being a question of the admission of divorce and the remarried to penance and communion, the exhortations interpreted may imply different, contrasting approaches to the Christian way of life, right? So the first dubium asks whether by following Al, I kind of like that. Does kind of put it in its proper context. End quote. It asks whether it has now become possible to grant absolution in the sacrament of penance and thus to admit to Holy Communion a person who, while bound by a valid marital bond, lives together with a different person, right, in a marital way, without fulfilling the conditions provided by the Familiaris Consortio, number 84, and subsequently affirmed by Reconciliatio et Penitentia, and I will put these words up there in Greek, page 34, and Sacramentum Caritatis, page 29. Can the expression in certain cases, notice this is what Pope Francis is famous for, can the expression in certain cases found in note 351 of the exhortation Al be applied to divorced persons who are in a new union and continue to live in this state? Right? Now, this is really, really important because why? Well, number one, not only the current position where there is a high number of divorces in the Catholic faithful, but what about in previous years? Those that had to follow church doctrine, that if they were divorced in a civil way, right? Because someone gets divorced in a civil way, that's civil. They file divorce papers. The state says you are no longer married. However, in a Catholic way, that has no basis. If a couple is split, what they must do is live a chaste life. In other words, not only can they not live with someone or remarry someone, they cannot have sexual relations with that person because they would be committing adultery, right? Now, when they say other than and they make reference to another church position, they're referring to an annulment, okay? Well, they noticed that the Pope didn't really have a lot of time for annulments. And I have to be honest with you, Vatican II type annulment process is what we call divorce light. It is not at all as rigorous as the traditional Catholic annulment process. So as good liberals always do, once they get their first position, they double down for their second. And so by Pope Francis saying that in certain cases, well, you know what, you better make that part of an official church position on what other cases are. Again, he never does that, and that's why they're calling him out on it. Now, the Cardinals wrote in their explanatory note that an affirmative answer to the first dubium would mean the church teaches either that divorce doesn't dissolve the marriage bond, but persons who are not married can, under certain circumstances, legitimately engage in actual sexual intimacy, that divorce dissolves the marriage bond, and that divorced and remarried are legitimate spouses and their sexual acts are lawful marital acts, or that divorce does not dissolve the marriage bond, but admitting persons to the Eucharist does not mean the church to approve their public state of life. The faithful can approach the Eucharist even with consciousness of grave sin, and receiving absolution in the sacrament of penance does not always require the purpose of amending one's life. The sacraments, therefore, are detached from life. Christian rites and worship are in a completely different sphere than the Christian moral life. Okay, now that's just the first dubia question. I want to end this episode here because this is a lot to take on, and I don't want to bury you in too much. Understand, the first question is, you came out and said, I think it was an interview, or I forget where he made the comment, that in certain circumstances, people should be allowed to remarry. Now, he did it much the same way he was talking about the sacrament of confession just a couple weeks ago. He always does this process of talking about an exception as if it's not going to be the rule. But eventually what liberals do is they always make the exceptions the rules, right? What do I mean by that? When we went through the 70s when they were trying to approve abortion, what did they say? Well, clearly there's incest and rape. So clearly you wouldn't want that person to have to go through the indignity of having a child. Yeah, we would. Okay. Well, clearly you have to admit the woman has to have a right to her body, and that by forcing her, they always are great at creating an exception to the rule. Matter of fact, after decades of abortions, when the abortion rate was getting up to hundreds of thousands a month, they finally went back and did the research and found out those cases of incest and rape were less than 1%. All these other abortions were needless convenience of not having to have a child and then have sex as much as you want because there's an abortion clinic down the block, right? Same as homosexuality. Clearly this person is a good person. They're born, and you don't want them to have to live their life out denying their inclination to wanting to have a sexual relation with the same person of the same sex. Yeah, we do want that prohibited. Why? Because it's against God's law. Well, but they're depressed and they're going to commit suicide. Once again, they found out the stats after that, when they started proving all this homosexuality, they were prone to it anyway. Same thing with transgender. So the reason I want to stop it here is what the Pope had done in that they were referring to in the first dubia question is what he continues to do. He attacks certain deposits of the faith that are key critical to identifying us as Catholics. And he rips them apart. By what? Just these one-off comments. So these cardinals are saying, we've had enough of this. We're going to ask you these questions one after another. We want at least a yes or no. Still he hasn't. So in the next episode, I'm sorry, this is going to take some time. And again, you may ask, what does this have to do with can a pope go to hell? Well, first of all, I wanted to distinguish between the sins a pope can commit and then the pope's position of infallibility, and then finally showing how if a pope plays around too much, the sins that he's creating are so tantamount that they're calling out to heaven for justice, okay? Let alone the damnation of a soul, right? So we need to know this. Now, as Catholics, if you want to be easy peasy and say, look, I'm not into all this stuff. I just want to go read my Bible, show up to church, do my thing. This stuff is just too heady. It's too complicated. I'm a simple Catholic. I'm going to tell you right now, if you continue to take that position, it's going to be like with your government, okay? One day you're going to wake up and there will be no country. One day you're going to wake up and you will have no church. You won't be able to just go to a church anymore. And we're starting to see that happen now. So do me a favor, become a student, follow me through these series, and I promise this will all make sense to you, right? So I'm going to pick up with the second dubia question, or what they call second dubium.